want to ask you from an economic perspective, how would you assess Nigeria's current macroeconomic environment, and how does this impact the industry?
My response to that question starts from the fact that right now, the Nigerian economy is on a reset. And I say that deliberately because when we look at the historical pattern with our economy from 1961 till date, can put it in 10-year planks, then two particular decades stand out. And that is 1981 to 1990, then 2001 to 2010. Now, why do I pick out those two? 81 to 90. For the decade, we had a negative average GDP growth rate. And that was about 0.18%. And then 2001 to 2010, we had the highest average GDP growth rate of about 7.87% annual average. Now, what were the peculiarities? Why did we have negative growth rate in those years? Now, the few issues that we can pick out are, number one, that was a period Nigeria became a nation that got entrenched in economic rent behavior. Secondly, corruption took a new turn, and then we saw a lot of leakages, all right, in fiscal operations of government. Also, within that period, we lost an opportunity to reform the economy. We tentatively started with SAP, but unfortunately we embarked on what we term as policy reversals, and of course instability over that period of time. But when you now look at 2001 to 2010, that was the period we reformed the economy, and then everyone began to see Nigeria as a possible destination for investment. That was also the period when Nigerian banking took a new turn in the sense of growth and the sense of what we might call agility. And I put that in context. And this is making reference to two things. First was sometime in January 1995, I was then chief economist and head of strategy of FCMB. And I told the founder of FCMB, who was my boss then, that I think something was wrong in the way we were running FCMB. That every one of us was dancing around you. Of course, Baba had 4 roles in FCMB then. Founder of the bank, majority shareholder, chairman of the board, and also chief executive officer. So his response was that, Biodu, don't you think this sort of thing will happen with my multiple roles? I said, yes, sir. But you see, for me as an economist, what that will lead us to is you make decisions, all of us will go and execute, and so FCMB will perform less than we are capable of, which case will not be optimal. So he then asked me, okay, what do you think we should do? I said, we need to restructure FCMB and think of 100 years' time. And that is, what do we need to change today in FCMB, January 1995, that will make the bank remain in operation, profitably so, and strong in 100 years' time? So the old man asked me, why 100? And I told him I chose 100 deliberately. Because number one, none of us will still be working for FCMB. Number two, personally, I don't pray to be around. But then I was 36 years old. 100 years' time will make me 136, looking for what? So the two of us laughed anyway. But I now told him something that changed the game in FCMB. I told him, FCMB is your dream, sir. And the prayer of every visionary is that his dream should outlast him. That was the game changer. So now, some 5 years ago, 2018, we're discussing the issue of banking globally. And one major thing, which came out strongly in this report, and I'm sure we still talk about that, okay? And that's the fact that banking will remain relevant in the contemporary economy, okay? But the players, the banks themselves, may not be the ones we see in 10 years' time, 20, 30, 50 years' time. So if you look at the macroeconomic today, we are in reset mode, which means we are reforming. And every time you reform, consequences come, inconveniences come. So the question for us is, how do you reposition your own entity, especially in context of the banks, where we talk about important things. Sustainability is key. Okay, resilience is key. Agility is key. And of course, you are looking at a tomorrow where your own brand wants to remain relevant and in operation.
I'd like to know from an industry perspective how you're managing the cost to income ratio and, of course, the cost of risk for sustainability.
Thank you very much. I think if I piggyback on what Doctor has said, we've seen the evolution of banks, and a key thing is said around that is the evolvement, the governance around making sure organization exists above 100 years. And one area that ensures that you're still in existence is your profitability, because then that's when you're very attractive to investors that want to invest in you. So from an industry perspective, we've realized that there's competition in the space. And while previously the competition we'll be looking at is the banks within ourselves. But interestingly, in recent times, we've seen that the fintechs have actually begun to play a very significant role in our space. And what that means is they run a very lean model in their operations. And so as banks, what we start asking ourselves to make sure the cost-to-income ratio makes sense to us is, one, how do we ensure if the revenue is not even growing, because now we have to share the pie, how do we reduce the cost to become a lot more efficient? So there are lines of cost that we look at as an industry. And for some reason, all eyes of the banks are on costs now, operational expense, a lot now, operating expense in that space, whether on the staff side or on the other operating expense. And also away from that is also us asking ourselves, how do we replicate the model of the fintechs? How do we operate a more lean model? With the fintechs, one space they operate well in terms of revenue is their non-interest revenue, because they're quick to come to market. The speed in which they act is extremely important. So you see banks investing in technology to reduce the cost of operating so they can grow the revenue. You need to employ like 20 people to reach out to 2,000 people. But for some reason, your phone can get to those 2,000 people if you have the right technology. So you see that strong focus in the industry on digitalization, which has become extremely important for us. But also away from that is also looking at our balance sheet. Now moving into efficiency of your balance sheet to say, how do I operate a capital light play? It becomes extremely important because the cost of, that's what feeds into cost of risk. The lighter you are in ensuring that the quality of your loans are high and you have efficiency in terms of the performance of your loan, but play more in the space of non-interest revenue, that revenue grows even though your cost as well you're paying attention to. So we tend to play more in the space of non-interest revenue. And so I'm sure in your analysis, you tracked a lot around the non-interest revenue of banks, which is the digital income that was spoken to on the report. So a lot of banks now, you see in the holdco structure, it's just really to compete in that space of non-interest revenue. And more, all our eyes are on those balls, not only in terms of the cost-to-income ratio, but also the efficiency we see in terms of our balance sheet, which we see in our cost of risk. That way, we'll reduce the cost of risk, which translates back to the profitability. Those two things will translate back to the profitability in the industry. And talking to other CFOs consistently, that's the conversation we are having, and that's where our eyes are on.
How does the concept of banks being dead and banking being alive resonate with the shareholders in terms of their perspective of evaluating bank market value, the banking market value?
Let's even try to define what is a bank so that we know if the banks are dying and then what is banking. A bank is a financial institution licensed by the regulator, in most instances the Reserve Bank or the Central Bank, to provide banking services. The key thing is that they must be licensed, so they have a license issued by the regulator. Then what is banking? Banking is all about taking money from the deficit unit, surplus unit, and giving to the deficit unit. It's basically arbitraging. So if you are saying banks are dying, but banking is still continuing, it simply means the concept that a regulator will issue a license to somebody to go and collect money from the surplus unit and give to the deficit units is dying. But the process of people who need to do business but they don't have sufficient money and they need somebody to give them that money will continue to be there. So what is happening is that because of advancement in technology, several platforms are available that do not require to go to the central bank to get a license. So they can also do the same thing that central bank was issuing license to people to do without getting a central bank license. And because of technology, they're also in a position to do that provider service at a more efficient cost and a shorter time. And that is why when you said banks are dying, but banking is still expanding. And banking will continue to expand as long as human beings exist, because we don't have equal resources. And you realize that those who actually creating value need more resources than those who are not creating value. And those who are not creating value are content or happy with providing their resources to those who will create value, and they must get a reward for it, which is why you talk of interest. Whether you even talk of non-interest banking services, there's still a share of profit. So in effect, technology is disintermediating the process of banking and providing the same banking service at a more efficient cost, which is also why for banks to survive, they need to go through that transformation process, which I'm happy that your presentations have shown, that banks are shifting away from form-based activities to service-based activities. And those service-based activities are riding on the strengths of technology. So we're going to continue to see a process where customers come to banks, they no longer just basically need the plain vanilla loan. They need some other additional services. Even when they did the loan, the loan is derived from the service they need. Somebody is on a payment platform, and then there is a deficit, and then you need to supplement it at that point. But it's not coming to you and say, just lend me money. So I think for banks, your emphasis should be, how do we continue to adopt technology? How do we continue to disrupt ourselves? That's why when you saw that the bank's income are actually diverging from fund-based to fee-based. And the beauty of the fee-based activity for the banks, the key thing for banks, that they have to integrate technology into their main service platform. They now need to begin to see themselves as not an institution that just go to the central bank to get a license to operate deposit and savings activities, but as institutions that primary responsibility is to provide financial services to the discerning public. And this process will no longer require anybody coming to the banking hall. I can't remember the last time I went to the banking hall. So technology is going to provide that platform, and banks must self-destruct their current structure, so adopt a new structure to survive. How does this affect shareholders? Or how does this affect the valuation of banks? If you look at the Nigerian capital market, the banking industry accounts for about 15% of market capitalization. But if you look at the banking industry as a share of the Nigerian economy, its share of the Nigerian economy is just about 4.77%. Because the financial and insurance industry accounts for about 5.26% of the Nigerian economy. And the banking industry accounts for 90% of the financial institutions and insurance. So if you do the arithmetic, banks account for just about 4.7% of the GDP, but account for 15% of market capitalization. Why is this so? It is so because the Nigerian banks have seen the highest level of adaptation or adjustment when it comes to the African banking industry. And we've seen a shift, a material shift from what we used to be to what we are today. I don't think there's any sector, any country in this Africa that has a banking industry adopt technology the way Nigerian banks have done. And that is reflecting in their performance. And investors are bidding for that performance. So I think for banks that are adept at transformation, which is why when you talk of your changes or modification of your categorization of the banks, and you're shifting away from just an asset-based bank, and I can tell you, I'm beginning to see banks that are very nimble in technological adoption. So adoption of technology will begin to be a major matrix to determine where banks will be in the near future. And that will drive their performance in terms of income and return to shareholders.